This is the Jedburgh podcast. I'm the host, Fran Racioppi. Each episode, I speak with transformative leaders, visionaries, drivers of change, and those dedicated to winning, no matter the challenge. The Jedburgh podcast is founded in the lineage of the Special Operations Jedburgh teams of the past and is sponsored by Talent War Group, an executive search and talent advisory. Visit talentwargroup.com for more. A percentage of all proceeds is dedicated to the Special Operations Warrior Foundation. As humans, we're creatures of habit. We like order, organization, and clarity. Most people strive in a set routine and excel when they're in some level of control. But we live in an ever-changing, complex world where every action has a reaction, and every reaction affects another action. In this episode, we kick off a new twist to the podcast, our how-to series on becoming a stronger leader. To learn how to thrive in today's dynamic world, I asked Dr. Alan Echtenkamp to join me in a conversation about operating in a world filled with volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Alan is an organizational psychologist and founder of Slingshot Leadership. He was previously the head of global talent management for Time Warner. Alan shared that crisis leadership requires vision, understanding, clarity, and agility. He defined authentic leadership, and he showed me the importance of awareness. He provided the framework for effective communication by thinking through the lens of the sender, the receiver, and the message itself. And Alan explained that in the post-COVID world, leaders of organizations will need to provide their teams a common sense of purpose and a choice in their future. Alan, thanks for joining me on the Jedburgh podcast.
Thanks for having me, Fran.
So this is episode 10. I think it's our first benchmark.
Absolutely.
We're sort of on the back end. We think there might be another surge, but it's a 100-year global pandemic. We had a tense and volatile election cycle. We've seen economic bust followed by historic boom in the financial markets. Social and societal conversations about race, gender, and equality have forced us all to think, and none of us have been unscathed in this journey over the last 12 months. And so today, I really want the focus to be on uncertain environments, crisis leadership, and this return to normalcy. So if you're willing to have that conversation, you're ready to go.
I'm ready to go.
I'm ready. So let's start with this concept of VUCA, right? And what's VUCA? It's volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. We talked about it in episode 1. We spoke about it with Mike Sorelli and George Randall, the authors of The Talent War. It's a term that was developed by the U.S. Army War College to describe the post-Cold War era. It's a critical environment by which Special Operations assesses elite talent. And we've transitioned that conversation into how do we assess elite talent in the business world using this same environment. But it's the absence of structure, limited information, limited resources, limited direction, except for maybe a clear goal or a clear end state. I think about the Jedburghs behind enemy lines in World War II. Win the war at all costs. That was it. It's how Special Operations operates in the world today. But it's also there in the business world. It's the corporate environment. It's what I call this 4-dimensional system and ecosystem where businesses live, where every decision has a reciprocal reaction, right? And nothing can be done in a vacuum. People in these times of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, they either get creative and they adapt and they thrive, or they have to walk away because they just don't understand it. They don't get it. They can't rationalize what's going on. It's a large part of your work, and it's a concept that you've spoken about with your development of executives. So can you talk about the roots of it and how is this applied and what have you seen in the business world?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Fran, I think it's a funny topic because for years we've been talking about this, and we've talked about it in the context of technology disruption, shifting consumer behaviors, changing regulatory environments, changing employee values and expectations. So organizations have been dealing with what we thought was VUCA for some time. And then COVID hit. And then everyone, I think, said, oh, well, actually, this is really VUCA. And so now what do we do?
We're here. It's real.
We're here. And it's true. And I think the challenge for leaders is always recognizing that they are people in this experience too, right? So part of the challenge of leadership is managing your own experience through this volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And then also recognizing your responsibility for how you bring others through this. So I think, there are as many definitions of leadership as there are snowflakes in the world. So it's useful to articulate what mine is, and it's not my own. It's like so much of my point of view taken from the wisdom of others. But when I think about leadership, I think about it as an influence relationship between leaders and followers that intend real change that reflect their mutual benefits. And so that comes from a leadership theorist named Rost. And I think that's an important definition because it emphasizes a few things. It's a relationship based on influence, right? Leadership is not an equal kind of dynamic, right? You are influencing someone else with your leadership. It's between people, and so that bears a responsibility, right? There is a moral and ethical responsibility to having influence on other people's lives. And part of that responsibility is that it reflects your mutual benefits. And so part of what happens to people when they go through these stressful moments is that sometimes it causes you to do the opposite of what's needed in that leadership situation. So in times of stress, we literally get more narrow in what we're able to focus on, what we're able to take in. And, I think it's probably an evolutionary reaction to whatever. There's a tiger in the grass. Like, what do I do? And I think part of the challenge for leaders in any environment, but particularly in a VUCA environment, is being able to manage their emotional experience in a way that doesn't deny that it's stressful, but actually uses that in a way that helps propel them forward and maybe more importantly, helps move other people through what is by definition an emotional experience.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about that need to look inward in times of crisis. And so you've stated in some works that you put together that social science tells us that in times of crisis and fear, we tend to become conservative, more insular, and less tolerant.
Yep.
Now, there is a risk during times of fear and uncertainty that we turn inward, behaving in ways that contradict what is needed in the moment. Yep. How do you identify that and then stop it?
Yeah. Well, you and I have talked about Amy Edmondson's work on psychological safety. And I think as you think about your own experience, part of it is recentering yourself on sort of your overarching moral purpose, right? What's your great vision for leadership? Who's the kind of leader that you want to be? I've had people say to me, I would be a great manager if only people knew what they needed to do and would do their jobs.
Without having to be told.
Exactly. And so I say, we all would be great managers if that were the case, but that's never true. And so, the challenge for leaders is managing your own emotional experience and being able to push through it anyway. And we can talk a little bit about what it takes to build that kind of resilience. I think for many leaders and organizations, they've been through some crucible. So using military experience as an example, right? There are kids with military experience who've been through leadership scenarios that people like me who have not served will never see, right? The level of stress is so high. So you develop these strategies for getting yourself through that. But then the flip side of that is, how do you create the conditions where people understand the risks and understand the sense of urgency, but also feel like they are supported and skilled to move themselves and their colleagues through that?
So what about this concept of VUCA prime? Vision, understanding, clarity, and agility.
So I think that has been put forth as the antidote, right? I mean, the truth is there are no silver bullets, but if you think about what's needed in times of volatility, one thing that can be helpful from leaders is to provide a clear vision. So often when we talk about leadership, we arrive first on this idea that visionary individual can help lead other people through uncertainty and volatility. And I think that's generally true. You don't want to over rely on charismatic leadership because then you miss other things. But I do think having a clear vision and a sense of purpose allows other people to see what a better future looks like and get on board with that.
Well, there's got to be a grounding function there, like
That's
a
right.
foundational function, because if you don't know where you're going,
That's right.
then how do you actually create stability?
That's right. And I think for the leader, that's why self-awareness is so key, right? So there's a professor at Case Western named Richard Boyatzis, and he talks about articulating your noble purpose. And I think that seems very maybe esoteric and philosophical, but in fact, it's the only real thing that you can use as the anchor to know if you are making choices that are consistent with your own and others' well-being, right? So anchoring it in that gives you a North Star. And if you can communicate that in an authentic and credible way, then people know who you are and they make the choice, whether or not that's something that they can get on board with it. I think in your first podcast, the Talent Work Group guys talked about how people follow you for who you are and what you represent. So if you don't know what that is, or if you're kidding yourself and you say, I stand for this when everybody thinks you stand for that, then it's very hard to get people mobilized, particularly in a crisis.
I think we can call that almost being real. And they did talk about it, that Mike and George talked about it in episode 1. But then actually, again, Jerry Remy talked about it in episode 3, where he said every day when he goes on the air as a broadcaster for the Boston Red Sox, he has to be real. Because if you're not real, and people will see right through you, they'll see you're a phony. And if you're faking it, that's going to come out.
That's right, 100%. And, there's a whole discipline in leadership theory called authentic leadership. And it's gotten some grief lately because I think people misunderstand what real means and what authenticity means. There's this idea that, authenticity is like fully revealing every thought, every impulse. It comes to my mind, I just say it, I don't process it. And I actually think authentic leadership is authentic in its link to leadership rather than what you feel in a given moment, right? So a good authentic leader is one who recognizes the role and responsibility that comes along with being a leader and becomes the best version of themselves in that, right? So it's not about expressing every doubt you have to your followers, right? Because that's going to disrupt your ability to sort of bring them along. But it's about being real and realistic about both some of the challenges, but also communicating the kind of energy and emotion that you need other people to have as they move through it.
I think people will term that, I tell it like it is. I hear leaders that I work with of organizations will say, oh no, with my employees, I tell it like it is. And I say, yeah, but do you understand how that's received?
That's right.
And I think that in their minds, they're being transparent, they're being open, they're providing this level of feedback. But on the receiving end, it comes across as abrasive or crass, or there's no filter and there's no respect for the work that they're doing. And so that theory of authenticity, of are you evaluating those around you and communicating with them in a sense that is telling them the reality of the situation, but doing it tactfully is what's going to drive the organization forward than just sitting here and saying, hey, I'm going to be honest with you. You suck today.
That's right. That's right. And I think part of that is recognizing. So I said there's this self-awareness piece, and I think that's critical. There was a great book a couple of years ago called Insights, where the book says essentially that 90% of people consider themselves self-aware, and the real number's around 15%.
Oh, yeah.
It's sort of like how everybody thinks they're an above average driver, which statistically is impossiable, right? Half of you have to be below average.
Now the car tells you when you're a bad driver, actually. It does with the autocorrect. It's like, hey, you're drifting. And so now you should be able to get those analytics and be able to say, like, we had to self-correct your driving 45 times in this trip.
Totally. There's probably a future in AI for leaders, right? You get a wristband and it knows what your guardrails are and it shocks you one way or the other, pushes you back. But I think that self-awareness piece is essential but insufficient for building credible leadership relationships. I think the other piece is that other awareness. And that's, I think, Fran, exactly what you're talking about, right? Part of our action in the world is based on the assumption that our intent is the impact that it's going to have, right? But in any relationship, in any communication, there's the sender, there's the receiver, and then there's the message, right? And so just because we don't intend to diminish your work doesn't mean that that's not how you're going to experience it, right? And so leaders have to bring a certain amount of humility to that relationship to say, look, my intent here is X, but I need to keep gathering data to make sure that it's coming across as X. And the paradox of senior leadership is that the more power you have in an organization, the less likely people are to give you honest feedback. And so it's the paradox that the more you need, the less you're going to get. And so leaders have to be active participants in that relationship and invite feedback in a way that allows people the safety, right? Going back to this Amy Edmondson and psychological safety-ish topic, gives people the permission to provide what is sometimes difficult feedback.
Well, let's talk a bit more about that, because yes, nobody wants to tell the boss, hey, you're all messed up.
That's right.
But that communication piece is the critical elements to responding to these types of environments, this volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. You have to be able to communicate those. And so we talk so much about transformative leaders, but we talk about it in terms of businesses and building organizations, and that there's this development of a vision, and then they have to figure out how to execute this vision. And so we think about leaders, at least I do sometimes, where they have the whole plan mapped out in their head. Maybe they have it, all documented, and there's this nice PowerPoint presentation, and they're going to stand up in front of their organization, or even if it's a small business, they're going to stand up in front of themselves, their business partner, the few employees that they have, and they're going to brief this thing in detail. They're going to look around the room and point and say, you're going to do this and you're going to do that, and direct people to action. And everyone's going to receive that information. They're going to know exactly what they have to do. And then magically, sometime down the road, days, weeks, months, years, right? All of a sudden, these great results happen. And then there's a big barbecue, right? And everyone's like, we've done it. But this is not the case. This is not the case. This is not reality, especially when you introduce uncertainty where there's not going to be a clear answer. It's this 4-dimensional space that I talked about and something's going to go wrong. It doesn't matter what that plan is. In the military, we would always say no plan survives first contact. In episode 2, actually, Jersey Mike's CEO, Peter Cancro, he talked about the 50 years of scaling Jersey Mike's from one single sandwich shop on the Jersey Shore to 2,000 stores across the globe and $2 billion in revenue. And he said, no plan we've ever put together has survived first contact. We've had to change and iterate on everything we've done. But when the situation is uncertain, the human instinct and basic management training and how people train mid to junior level managers, that can delay action. And we almost ingrain people to downplay the threat until the situation becomes clear. One of the things that we would talk about in decision making in the military was understand what you know, understand what you don't know, and then understand what you need to know. And if you think about it like that, then you can start to kind of create first action steps. But there's also this fear of taking the wrong step, saying the wrong thing, which then you spread panic, you spread confusion. And that forces you as a leader to sit back and say, well, maybe it's not happening. Maybe if I just sit here for long enough, all of this will go away. And, it was just a bad dream and it will self-correct. And so instead of acceptance, you have a tendency to want to stand up and say, it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. And in the back of your mind, you're thinking, I'm hoping it's just going to go away. But hope is also not a course of action. There was a course I took in the military where if you briefed the word hope in any of your plans, hopefully the enemy will retreat. You're done. That's it. You failed the exercise. You're going to get to hopefully do it better the second time, because hope is not a course of action. And that applies to anything in life. You can't just sit there and say, I hope it's going to work out. But the reality is that by the time we often understand what the true threat is, it's too late.
That's right.
The effects have been felt, and the public will probably know about it by then. And so how do you think about this in terms of initial responses of leaders and then facing this denial and then transitioning that denial into an acceptance and a call to action?
Yeah. I think a couple of things. One, which you highlighted, is that leadership is action, right? Leadership is a verb. And often we confuse leaders and leadership happens as an action in these interpersonal moments and micro moments, right? So I often talk about how leadership is possible at any level in the organization, right? It's about influencing other people in a way that moves them forward in a positive direction. And so I think that also links us back to this VUCA prime category, right? So we talked before about vision and understanding being a way to help move people through volatility and uncertainty. I think the CA in VUCA prime, clarity and agility, help people move through complexity and ambiguity. And why that's important is that part of what we recognize as leaders is that we are people in this relationship too, and that we're going to be wrong. And there are going to be things that we know and don't know. And there are going to be things that we know that we can't communicate in that moment, right? And I think reasonable people know that a 10-year plan is probably going to change over time.
A 2-year plan, if that.
2-year, a 12-day plan.
Yeah.
Any organization at best only has the correct strategy for right now, right? And that's at best. Many don't, right? Any organization only has the right operating model for right now. And so for leaders and organizations, it's about getting comfortable with what you know and what you don't know and being able to respond quickly. And it's about creating the conditions where other people feel safe to do that. right? So we often hear people talking about how they need leaders in their organizations to take smart risks. And yet there are ways to encourage risk taking in organization life, right? And there are ways that sometimes we unconsciously discourage it. And so for leaders and organizations, part of what you need to test yourself on is, am I role modeling the kind of agility that I want to see in other people? And am I permitting them to do the same, right? Do I punish failure or do we learn from failure? Do I respond quickly and responsively, or do I go back into my shell and hope it passes over?
The agility piece that you just brought up, I think, is really important, because there has to be agility in your thought process, and there has to be agility in how you communicate, right? And so you brought up Professor Amy Edmondson, and she had a partner that she wrote with a series of articles about this very topic, Michaela Curisi. And they bring this up. They say that there are unique challenges that ambiguous threats pose to leaders, such as cognitive biases, dysfunctional group dynamics, organizational pressures that push leaders towards continuing to discount risks and delaying action, which leads to this catastrophic end. And they note a series of steps that you can take, or really strategies that you can use as a leader to make sure that you don't fall into this trap. And the 4 of them are: act with urgency, communicate with transparency, respond productively to missteps, and engage in constant updating, which requires you as the leader to be agile in your thinking, it's a little bit reactive, but it also makes you proactive if you're thinking like this, because you're thinking about what the next steps are. And so you're overcoming that thought of a leader who has to stand there and be stoic and say, I've created the plan, we're going to stick to the plan, and that's it. And I'm interested in your thoughts on these 4 steps, and maybe we start with this act with urgency.
Yeah. And I think that highlights a couple of things about these kinds of crisis environments, right? It requires a different kind of leadership behavior if your ship is sinking than it does if you're on a steady state course, right?
And accepting that the ship is sinking.
Yeah, that's step 1.
The first
right?
step.
Exactly. And also recognizing that people who ordinarily want voice in a decision may not want voice in that moment, right? They look to leaders to act with urgency, and that's part of the responsibility of the job, right? So again, we'd all love to be leaders if people would just do what they were supposed to do, but
we could do a whole conversation, I think, about that. I'm going to write it down, because we could do a whole conversation about the people in organizations who have all the feedback for the leader until they're the one who's in charge. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, I didn't say that. It's almost like when you're on the highway and you're in the fast lane and there's the person behind you who's riding your bumper and you get over, and then all of a sudden they drive right next to you.
Right.
Because now they're the one who's going to get pulled over. I mean, you see that in organizations all the time.
That's right. And sometimes it's not even as dramatic a leap in power, right? Sometimes a peer gets elevated. So what does that mean for the relationship and the dynamics in the team? It's a tricky thing to navigate. I love there's this George Carlin bit where he talks about how everybody that drives slower than you on the highway is a moron, and everybody that drives faster than you is a maniac, right? So we tend to calibrate everything relative to our own experience. And I think this agility thing allows us to act with urgency because we're not necessarily waiting for more information to happen. But I also think some people tend to think more about their experience as being internal than interdependent with others, right? So the reason acting with urgency is so important is that you are demonstrating a direction for people who in that situation might not know what to do. So again, going back to COVID as an example, the threat is real, right? And so the kind of leadership and urgency that's required in that moment to productively get through it is very specific. And it also gives people an idea about where they can be helpful. And so I think the worst thing in a crisis is a sense of powerlessness. And when you have leaders who are not acting with urgency or communicating with transparency, then people feel like adrift. People feel like they are a victim of their circumstance. And if you can get them aligned and organized and rowing in a direction, even if you have to change that direction at some point, it gives people a sense of power in that situation. And that's incredibly important.
So when you talk about communication with transparency, I mean, we talked a little bit about that a few minutes ago, but you have to tell people the honest truth about what's going on, but you can't instill fear and panic, right? Where everybody, we would call it, they light their hair on fire, right?
Right.
Gasoline on says, and all of a sudden they light their hair on fire and run around and everything is wrong. There's despair everywhere. So you have to keep them grounded in the reality of the facts without propping them up with false hope, but without breaking them down into these levels of despair that all is lost. So how do you do that? What's that middle ground?
Well, I think it usually depends on the crisis. I think part of the emotion you're trying to evoke in people depends on the behavior you need from them. And so sometimes you're trying to invoke a sense of calm and composure, right? So everybody move towards the exits slowly and in an organized fashion and in a line. And sometimes you need a heightened sense of urgency. And so that's the leadership communication message, right? So you're communicating with transparency, but with intent. So you're sharing the right information at the right time with the right people in order to elicit the right feeling and right behavior. So usually when we think about communication, often we think about what information do we want people to have, and that's critically important. But just as important is what's the emotional experience that you want them to have in that moment, and what do you want them to do with that experience? And that helps the leader decide not just what do they share, but how do they share it.
What about when the leader gets it wrong? We call this responding productively to missteps. When they get up there and they say something, I mean, we saw it a lot in the early days of COVID. I was laughing last night about how in the first days of COVID, it was wear a mask, don't wear a mask. And you look back on some of those.
You can't find a mask. There are no masks.
Right? Yeah. And people are like, well, they told me not to wear a mask. Now you can't go anywhere without a mask. So, I mean, when you get it wrong, how do you fix it?
Yeah. I think if you have a trusting relationship with the people around you, then that gives you credibility to change your mind, right? So if you think about wearing a mask as an example, part of what we were dealing with at the beginning of the pandemic was uncertain scientific evidence. But if you believe that people who are studying this in a rigorous and systematic way are going to discover new information that's going to cause us to change our point of view, then you can tolerate that shifting landscape, right? Because you can follow that. I think back to the point that you brought up earlier, if you create a heightened sense of fear and a heightened sense of powerlessness, then it's going to feel like that shifting landscape is in uncertainty or unreliability, right? And I think the fundamental ingredient in that relationship that determines which way it goes is trust, right? So I don't know if you read the book Sapiens by Yuval Harari, but he talks about how trust is one of these foundational elements of human relationships. And so when I think about trust just like leadership, there are probably a billion definitions of trust. So I've smashed them together for my own because I can only remember 3 things. And I think a trusting relationship is one in which you are competent, you're reliable, and you care about the other person, right? So if we believe that the leader is generally competent, even if sometimes wrong, if that leader has integrity and delivers on what she or he commits to, and that leader cares about us, we're much more likely to get through that and give them some benefit of the doubt in offering an opportunity to change their minds.
And different information is going to come to light, which brings up this fourth piece of this, which is this engaging and constant updating, where you're going to learn as the leader new information as you go, just like we have through COVID, just like we do in the evolution of business plans, and as market dynamics change, as sales data changes, as clientele changes and customer perception changes and their desires change. So being able to surround yourself with people who can provide you the right level of information for you to then make decisions is a critical piece of this.
That's right. And I think there's a critical role for leaders empathizing with the follower experience in 2 ways. One is realizing that the leader is usually out in front. And by that, I mean they have already seen the signs and they're trying to move the organization in that way. And so what the leader has to empathize with the follower is that they're just not there yet, right? They may get super excited about this change in direction, but you need to recognize that you as the leader have already moved through your own grief and loss period of mourning what was, and you need to bring other people along in that. I also think part of what we need leaders to do in organization life is to understand what's changing and what's not, right? So if you're communicating and updating your strategy, part of what people need to recognize is that not everything is changing, right? In most aspects of life, particularly if you are a leader with a clear, noble purpose, the values that define you aren't going to shift that much. Maybe some of the activities are going to do that. The only exception that I think of in my own life is having children, right? Before I had kids, everybody said, yeah, everything changes. And I was like, how can that be possible? Everything changes? And then you have kids and everything changes?
Everything.
Every single
thing. And then
thing.
it keeps changing as they get older. It continues to change.
Nothing builds tolerance for ambiguity like parenthood. But with the exception of that, a lot of these things in organization life give us the opportunity as leaders to say, look, we're going to move in a new strategic direction. We've got a new entrant in our competitive space who is trying to disrupt our business model. So we're going to pivot and do this. But at our core, at our identity, at our culture, those things are not going to change, right? I remember years ago when I was at Time Warner, there was this sort of race between HBO and Netflix, right? So does HBO become Netflix before Netflix becomes HBO, right? They were these sort of competing business models. And so I think when you're leading an organization, by definition, always new information is going to come, always new competitors, always new technologies. And so as a leader, part of what you have to do for your people is help them get through that. And part of it is not about being nice, right? Sometimes situations present themselves where the challenge is very high. So people work, you look at the sort of pharmaceutical value chain over the last year, right? Not just drug developers, but Corning developing the little vials that the drug goes in and people developing lab equipment, right? They had to sort of ramp up very quickly. So it wasn't like, a 4-day week, 3-day weekends, people go to the beach, right? It was about ramping up the tension and production, which is fine for people as long as you also ramp up the support, the community, the culture, right? People are willing to give more than their share as long as they feel supported and I think loved in organization life, right? I don't think it's too soft to say that we develop loving relationships with the people that we work with, in part because we spend more time with them than maybe anyone in our lives besides our immediate family, right? So if you go to work and don't feel loved and supported, it's going to be a drag.
And that support and love now takes us to kind of that final phase of crisis leadership, which is you got to get people back to work. You got to get people refocused. I mean, at some point, this crisis, this problem, it's going to subside. It's going to end. There's going to be a return to some sense of normalcy or a new normalcy, which I don't necessarily love that term, but I mean, it's true, right? There's a new normalcy. We don't really know what that is, but lessons are going to have been learned, but people, teams, organizations, societies in the world, they may have changed. I mean, the global pandemic has changed every facet of society. Terrorism attacks, you see that, after 9/11, we've seen that in London. They saw that after the London tube bombings years ago. Natural disasters do that. And some changes are for the better and some are for the worse, I think. And so you have to kind of be aware of what's working. How do we get better? I mean, look at now we do everything remote. I mean, how many times prior to the pandemic did you fly across the world for a one-day meeting? That's not happening anymore.
Right.
There's no need anymore. We've advanced technology now and forced to jump start and leapfrog, probably a decade in our thought process of how we actually do some of these things because of it. But there's still uncertainty and there's still undefined boundaries. And so I think about transformational leaders that they need to know what's going to resonate with their people to bring them back into the fold, bring them together and reintegrate and operate in this new normal. So as the leader, how do you assess first when your team or your organization is ready to accept that new normal? And then what are the first steps that you take to building that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think this new normal is, talk about ambiguity, right? Nobody really knows what the future looks like. And I like to believe that there is an optimistic, I'm not going to say hopeful, because I know that that's a problem in your strategic planning, hope, but
no hope.
But an optimistic viewpoint on that there is an opportunity for us to redesign these communities that we call organizations in ways that better serve not just the needs of the business and the needs of shareholders, but also the needs of the people who comprise them. And so I think as leaders think about coming back to work, part of what we need to do is be intentional about how we understand the moral relationship and the moral interdependence we have with the people around us, because any interpersonal situation brings a moral element, right? And so whether or not you choose to acknowledge it, there's a responsibility we have. There's a woman at Rutgers named Joanne Shula who talks about ethical leadership. And she says that leadership is a complex moral relationship between people based on trust, obligation, commitment, emotion, and a shared vision of the good. And so again, going back to this self-awareness piece, we have opportunities in organization life to get clear about what we think our vision of the good is. And then we have an opportunity to get other people on board with that. And so how do we do that? We build trusting relationships where our vision of the future is compelling to people, both in its objective value and its also subjective resonance, and create the conditions and structures and operating models that allow us to fulfill that collective vision of the good, the shared vision of the good. I think what is an opportunity in disruption is that we've broken the old mold, right? So there were assumptions that some organizations had about working from home, right? We don't want anybody working from home. We need to see that they're in their offices. And it turns out it wasn't so terrible for them, right, to have people work from home. And so sometimes you need a crisis to unfreeze your mental model of what's possible. But I think what we need to do before we refreeze into whatever the new normal is consider with intent, what's the environment that we want? What are the relationships among people that we want? And what are the metrics for performance that we want? You know, I think in the last 10 or 20 years, the power of the shareholder has become outsized in making organizations' decisions. And if we can reconsider that and to say shareholders are one stakeholder in this relationship, and in fact, there are other similarly important stakeholders that we need to attend to, then we set up systems that support that.
With the employees and the rest of the team being a key stakeholder.
Exactly.
So if the vision aligns everybody and it gets that buy-in and it draws everybody back into the organization because people align to vision. I mean, you can't build great things without everybody who sits there saying, I'm doing this because I want to make this great. What about choice? If you spread choice around, so there's this, the perception always becomes, and I hear it a lot because people are like, oh, well, you were in the military, so you made all the decisions. And my comment is, no, actually, decision-making is centralized at certain leadership levels. But the input to that decision-making actually is bottom-up, where you're going to go around the organization and the best ideas come from those people who are operating and the ones who actually have to execute. The team members who actually have to put the rubber to the road on this and make it work. When you look at them and you say, what do you guys want to do? What do you think about this? Sure, I might make the decision, but other input is critical in the evaluation of the best decision to make. And so if you spread choice around in times like this, can that help to foster that community?
Yeah, I think you spread choice and I think you spread leadership, right? So part of what typifies an agile organization is that leadership can come from anywhere. And in fact, to your point, a lot of the best insights come from the sensing system at the boundary of the organization. And so those, by definition, are all of the people who touch your suppliers, your customers, the outside world is shelled with people across the organization. So why would you ever have one person make a decision about that, right? A lot of that important data comes from throughout the organization. And so just like leaders need to create a condition where they get feedback about their own effectiveness, they also need to get information so that they can make informed decisions about where the enterprise needs to go. And this idea that the organization structure or this hierarchy of jobs is the same thing as the operating model, I think sometimes gets in the way of organization decision-making. So there become these layers that you've got to work through. And I think the exciting thing about organization design, or the exciting opportunity, is to rethink how these social systems activities work so that they can be dynamic and fluid and respond quickly, rather than having to go through some sort of structured chain of command when it doesn't make sense.
Well, Alan, we covered a lot of stuff.
And I'm wrung out, Fran.
I love the conversation, and I love how we're able to really unpack the how-to on this. And so I literally have a list here of, and you've seen me writing. I've been muting my microphone and writing so that it doesn't interrupt you. But I have a list now that we're going to execute on over the course of the next couple of months. We're going to do this a few more times. We're going to keep doing it. We're going to provide this how-to. We're going to tie in the conversations from some of the stories of elite performance, and we're going to give the listeners an opportunity to get better every single day as they listen to this Jedburgh podcast about how to become great elite performers every single day.
Thanks so much, Fran. I really appreciate it.
American Jedburghs went on to form the foundation of the United States Special Forces and the Special Activities Directorate of the Central Intelligence Agency. Thanks for listening to the Jedburgh podcast. I'm your host, Fran Racioppi. We're brought to you by the Talent War Group, an executive search firm and talent advisory. We'll drive you to attract, retain, and develop top talent. With services like leadership development, talent acquisition, and keynote speeches, we work with you and your teams to create talent solutions to business problems. To get started, visit talentwargroup.com. Join us next week for a new episode of the Jedburgh podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you heard, give us a like and leave a review. Follow me, Fran Racioppi, and the Talent War Group on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, and send your comments and inquiries to info@thetalentwar.com. As former members of Special Operations Forces, the Jedburgh podcast and the Talent War Group contribute a percentage of all profits to the Special Operations Warrior Foundation, supporting the families of our fallen warriors. Thanks for joining us on this episode. How you prepare today determines success tomorrow.